Thank you again for your patience as we allow our virtual room to fill up. And we also have participants on, not Zoom, but on YouTube. And we're getting connected to stream there now. It looks like we have 56 participants. We have many more registered. Virtual room to fill up, and we also have participants on, not Zoom, but on YouTube. And we're getting connected to stream there now.
Just a note, we'd like to.
It looks like we have 56 participants. We have many more registered. Virtual room to fill up. I think we might have had some feedback. If someone else was watching us in another room, you heard that 2 times. I only said it once, but I hope you got the message. We have 59 participants online. We want to respect the time of those who are with us right now. So we'll get started in just another minute. Let me check with the back office and make sure we are connected with our YouTube audience.
We'd just like to remind the YouTube audience, if you would like to fully participate, we encourage you to come over to the Zoom meeting in order to ask questions. The YouTube live stream will be for viewing only. Thanks.
All right, we're at 6:35. If the team would like to get started, we certainly can. Does that sound good, Brian?
That sounds good. Before we get started here, let's make sure captions are enabled. That's one thing I want to do, make sure we get enabled. But thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Really appreciate you showing up to learn more about what we are doing on the Clifton corridor. This will be very interactive. I'll give the presentation first, and then we'll have question and answer at the end. So with that, what I want to do is go ahead and get started and be cognizant of people's time. So I'm going to move forward in the presentation where we'll do a little housekeeping here.
Sure, I'll take that on for you, Brian. Before we jump into the conversation, everyone, you might have heard some of this housekeeping. But just to reiterate, if you're participating with us on Zoom tonight, it means you registered, you got a link, and now you're here. You will have full functionality to interact with us. What that means is we have a chat feature that you can use to communicate with us, communicate directly to other participants, and you can put your comments and questions there throughout the meeting. We are going to deliver the presentation first and reserve time at the end of the conversation for exactly that conversation, discussion, questions, and comments at the end. If you would like to, you can come on video and audio and ask your question by raising your hand. There is a raise your hand feature in Zoom that you can select to notify us that you would like to ask a question. The moderator will be notified and will acknowledge you and allow your audio to be heard, and you can come on and ask your question there. If you are participating with us on the phone, you will have to press *9 on your telephone keypad to raise your hand. The operator will come on and let you know that the moderator has been notified, and we will recognize you and allow you to come on and voice your question there. If we experience any technical difficulties tonight, we thank you in advance for your patience as we work them out. If you are participating on YouTube, it's been said before, if you want to have ability to ask questions and submit your comments live, for discussion, come over to the Zoom platform. The registration information is on our website, Clifton, connectclifton.com. And if you have any service questions or issues, you can always reach out to MARTA through the email listed on the screen. That's custserve@itsmarta.com, CUSTSERV@itsmarta.com, or call the service phone number 404-848-5000. And that's all the housekeeping. We don't want to delay the conversation. Brian, can you give us the agenda tonight?
All right. Thank you, Whitney. So, all right, what are we talking about tonight with the Clifton Corridor? So one thing we're doing, the purpose of this meeting is to learn about the alternative analysis process. And then for you as stakeholders and the public within the corridor, give feedback on the screen one alternative that we're looking at so far. One thing we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about what we're looking at with regards to doing this study and alternative analysis. We'll look at some of the different demographics in the area. We'll look at mode and alternative comparisons. And then we'll talk about the next steps, and we'll talk a little bit about where we're going from here and how we get to a point where we can get a new LPA. And then, as kind of mentioned, we'll have question and answer session for you to be able to ask all the questions that you can, and we'll see that we can answer those. Project team, just to give you an overview of who's on the team right now, who you can contact if you have any questions outside after this meeting. So I myself, Brian Hobbs, being the project manager for MARTA, I'm overseeing this project. Shelley Peart, who is the interim AGM of planning for MARTA, Greg Jafrida, who's the director of communications and engagement for capital projects for MARTA, Peter Voorhees, who's AECOM project manager, and then Content Terry, who's consulting and public involvement. So if you reach out to anyone on this list here, feel free to ask questions, and you will be sure to get an answer of some sort. So now what I want to do, just start off first, is talking about the project in general, the overall view of the project. As you all know, or some know, this is proposed to be a high capacity transit service through a regional employment and institutional corridor. I think some of the things that many of you know is that this is one of the highest employment areas within the Southeast. And so it is very important that we do get transit connectivity. So the purpose and need of this project is very important. Frequent and reliable transit is needed to serve the corridor because of right now. We do have bus service in the corridor, and there's also Emory shuttles, but we still need a more reliable transit system connectivity. Pretty much to the MARTA rail system is something we're looking for from a better connectivity standpoint. So that's some of the purpose and need of this project. And then I kind of mentioned improved access to MARTA rail. This project that we're looking to implement here on the Clifton Corridor will give us an opportunity, as you can see here, to touch the red and gold line, as well as touching the blue line. So that connectivity is very important, and one of the reasons that we want to build high capacity transit in this area. I started with a little bit of project history. As many of you know, we've actually been studying this corridor since 2008. As you can see from this timeline here, we don't even have 2008 on here, but 2012, we'll start from there when MARTA adopted a locally preferred alternative. That is still the currently locally preferred alternative. That is actually alternative 7, which is fully underground bore tunnel, as well as alternative 6, which is above ground. So those are the two alternatives that are current and that are what we're looking to replace here by the year 2023. Just a couple of milestones and things that really happened that made us want to go back and look at this project, at the different modes and alternatives. One of those major milestones was in 2016-17, when the More MARTA program was passed. When the More MARTA program was passed, we actually had some dedicated funding from the city of Atlanta to be committed to this project. And so that in general, that was a new development for this project. And so it did warrant us to go back and start looking and seeing how we can progress this project forward. We also looked in 2018 at an opportunity to reevaluate the project and see what more we could do from a value engineering standpoint. We did come up with an opportunity to adopt a new LPA as we wanted to remove alternative 7. However, we did not move forward on that. The pandemic came around and we decided to start looking at different mode alternatives because mode alternatives were starting to, such as BRT, bus rapid transit, was starting to become a mode that is more readily available and it's just as economically efficient as LRT. And so in 2022, what we're doing right now, we are looking to adopt a new LPA. So this study from the alternative analysis, what we're looking to do is basically evaluate mode and different alignments, and so that we can have a new LPA by 2023. And we'll get a little bit more into this process a little bit later, but this just is the project timeline and the history so far of where we are. So the alternative analysis, as I mentioned, we'll get into a little bit. The process. What we are currently we're in screen 1 evaluation. The screen 1 evaluation of this project, we have 10 alternatives that we're evaluating, and that's what we want to get feedback from you on. As you can see, we've started this back in December 21 when we were developing the alternatives, but now we're at a point where we want you to weigh in on these different alternatives and we're going to start looking at things from the evaluation criteria and so forth. Then we'll get things down to a screen 2 evaluation where we will have at a minimum of 3 alternatives where we'll be looking to move forward. There could be more, but right now we're anticipating 3 alternatives that we will go into more detailed design on. We will come back to you in the fall in that way that you will also have another opportunity to weigh in on the narrowed down alternatives. And so you can be looking out for that. But what we're looking for today is for you to be able to help us get down to those 3 alternatives, and so that we can get to a more detailed level of design. And then you'll see here, as I kind of mentioned, we'll be looking to do LPA scoping and MARTA board adoption between September 2022 and March 23. So what are some of the reasons that we're here today and why we are now reevaluating the Clifton corridor, the mode, as well as the actual alignment? So on the screen here, you'll see a few things that are new and some of the reasons we're back here. Bus rapid transit, as I kind of mentioned earlier, BRT, that is now a mode within the United States that is becoming much more visible. We don't have it in this region just yet. We will soon with the Summerhill BRT as well as Clayton. But that is another opportunity for us to go back and evaluate a mode that is just as efficient as light rail. With this, we are still looking at light rail as well. But one thing that is new is that we are looking at off-wire rail technology. That has grown over the last few years. That technology has really become more advanced. And so that is something we definitely want to look at now as we go forward with this project. It's aesthetically pleasing. And so that's something we want to look at. The CSX corridor focus. In the past, there have been conversations, but there was reservation about utilizing the CSX corridor because those conversations had not moved further along. We're further along with those conversations. They're great. They've been great so far. We're hoping to continue them and to come to an agreement with CSX of some sort. And so that's another change with this project that has allowed us to come back, or has warranted us to come back and review what we're looking at from a locally preferred alternative. We're also now considering an East Terminus station at the Decatur station. That is something we're looking at because once we go back from an alternative analysis standpoint, we want to look at from a holistic standpoint, the totality of the area, just to get them an opportunity to make sure that we're making the right decisions with the Terminus station. So Avondale and Decatur, which Decatur is pretty close to Avondale, we are now looking at the entire area just to make sure that we're not leaving any stone unturned when it comes to selecting the Terminus station and continuing to move this project forward. The corridor changes. So there have been many corridor changes with over the last few years. As you can see, 2012, you can imagine how much development has happened. And so we want to go back and make sure that this project, that we are still able to build a project along one of these alignments without any interruption from development. So I want to talk a little bit about mode comparison. One thing I just kind of mentioned earlier is that we're now looking at BRT as a serious mode for MARTA, as you've seen with the other projects that BRT is a mode that we will be implementing in a lot of locations. And so what is BRT, which is bus rapid transit? So right now, at MARTA, our bus rapid transit service is intended to be rail-like. So rail-like in the sense that it will operate like our rail lines. It will also have the amenities and infrastructure similar to our rail lines because it is a premium service. And so we want to make sure that you understand that the BRT systems, the bus rapid transit systems for MARTA really are intended to operate similar to our rail. We are also looking at, from a dedicated lane standpoint, one thing MARTA is one thing we want to make sure is that our threshold for dedicated lanes is pretty high. Right now, we're looking at 70% of dedicated right-of-way must be 70% for a BRT, for us to call it BRT. Right now, the federal minimum is 50%. And so we're very serious when we say we want our BRT systems to be high capacity and similar to our rail and operating. If you take a look here on the slide, just to give you a few of the tidbits on what makes this a premium service, we're still talking 10-minute peak frequencies or less with BRT. We're still talking dedicated operating lanes. As I mentioned earlier, fully dedicated lanes, we would like 70% of the corridor to be dedicated. Unique transit line and vehicle branding, that will be a part of a BRT system or a BRT corridor. Station amenities. These are actually going to be full-on stations. If you look here to the right, bottom right here, you actually see in the photo, those are full stations. These are not just shelters. These are stations with a lot of amenities that you would typically see at a light rail or a rail system. And then transit signal priority, that gives us an opportunity to be able to move through quickly and efficiently through the streets or the dedicated right-of-way. So again, this is a premium service that we want to operate similar to light rail. Most of you may know light rail for this corridor. That's something we've talked about for a long time. It's always been in the LPA. And just to talk a little bit about the opportunity there from a 10-minute peak frequency or less, similar to our BRT. Embedded tracks, that's probably the biggest difference that we have. Once we implement light rail, we're not going to move it because it's embedded tracks for BRT we possibly can move. Unique vehicle branding. As you know, we will have unique vehicle branding on all of our rail systems. Overhead electric wire technology. That is something that is current, but what is new is the off-wire rail technology. You can see here again, if you look at the picture on the bottom right, you will see that is a off-wire rail technology battery-powered LRT system with a tram. So that is something we're looking at for this corridor as well. So both of these modes are premium and both of these modes are being considered equally as we move forward. So let's get in a little bit into the screen one alternatives. Talk a little bit about the different routes and based on the different modes that we're looking at. So the BRT, the bus rapid transit alternatives, we do have 4. If you take a look at this map, one common thing that you will see is that about 80% of the corridor, 70 to 80% of the corridor is within this CSX right-of-way. That is, again, this is something we're hopeful and we've had some great conversations. And so we wouldn't be showing this if we didn't think the conversations were going well with CSX. They've been great partners so far. And we look to get an agreement with them very soon. But as you can see, majority of the corridors within CSX does not matter what the alignment is. But if you look towards Lindbergh, you do have a little difference. This will be on surface streets in some instances. So that is a little different. As well as when you look at North Decatur Claremont, this is where we split. This is where you start to see the alignment going towards Avondale, which we do have 1 for BRT, and then the other 3, which are going towards Decatur Station. Again, what we're doing is looking from a holistic standpoint of what that looks like from a connectivity standpoint for a Terminus station. That does not mean we're changing the Terminus station just yet, but as part of the alternative analysis, we want to make sure we capture everything in this area to make sure we're going to be making the right decision from an efficiency and operating standpoint. Now let's look at the light rail alternatives. One thing I would like to point out with the light rail immediately here so that you can understand that we still have the current LPA. So if you look at the green line, that is LRT3, that is our current LPA. That is the current MARTA locally preferred alternative. That is the one going down Clifton Road. So this is a much more impactful alternative, but it is included in our 6 for LRT. Common theme, commonality here. Again, within CSX's right of way. Majority of the corridor is within CSX's right of way. You'll see here at Lindbergh, again, we'll touch some of the surface streets, so we'll have to work with local jurisdiction and GDOT here. But again, once we get to North Decatur, Claremont, we split off. So we have multiple alternatives, 3 going to Avondale from a light rail perspective. And then we do have 3 going to the Decatur station from a light rail perspective. As you can see a bend here. But again, majority of the corridor, 70 to 80% of the corridor is within CSX's right of way, except for LRT 3, which is the current LPA. So what are we looking for, and what are the key takeaways and differences when we start to look at the different alternatives and different modes? I'll go through some of the criteria of evaluation and how we're looking at each one and evaluating them going forward, just to give you an idea of some of the things and the impacts that we look at. From a project purpose and need, we're looking at everything from alignment length, transit connectivity, travel times, average speed, population served, job served, multimodal connections, and land use TOD opportunities. So those are some of the things we look at when we talk about a project's purpose and need while we're building this project. We also are looking at minimizing impacts, everything from environmental impacts to construction impacts, roadway operations, historical resources, noise and vibration, you name it, community impacts. Those are the things we are looking at when we look at each of the alternatives and mode going forward. Something we also have to take and be cognizant of is the funding potential. Capital cost for each one. Each one of these alternatives have a different capital cost. They also have a different operating cost and maintenance cost due to where we're going and the different types of modes. So again, these are some of the things that we have to take in consideration when we're moving forward. And then the public and stakeholder input, you guys. Getting information from you all. We want to make sure we have a consensus, or we have a near consensus on what we want to implement and what we want in this region to be built. So this is very important. Obviously, MARTA input, equity analysis, and then freight rail impacts, which is another major item that we have to take into consideration. This next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the land use and transit-oriented development that we are considering along the alignments. One thing I will point out, why this does say BRT alternatives, this goes for the LRT as well. If you look, every single station node except for one has good to excellent, and maybe a moderate, good to excellent TOD potential. We're only seeing one station right now, one station location around Scott Boulevard, where we're seeing low potential for TOD. So that is very good from a standpoint of being able to build affordable housing, being able to have retail and things of that nature around the stations. So we do see great potential regardless of the mode and regardless of the route for TOD opportunity. And that is something we are going to pursue and we are continuing to look at. So let's talk a little bit about the East Terminal comparisons. Again, we're looking at Avondale, which is the current LPA, part of the current LPA, and Decatur alternative. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about now, just some of the key takeaways that we're seeing, the differences in the two terminus stations. So you have overall takeaways when you look at Avondale, you do touch more activity centers and development opportunities when you start talking about the Avondale alternative. When you look at the Decatur alternative, the overall takeaway is that there are lower travel times and costs, as well as existing transit-oriented development already at the Decatur station. Then you start to talk about jobs and equity. From that standpoint, we do see a higher population and employment being touched when we go to the Avondale alternative. But for the Decatur alternative, we are seeing a higher share of population below poverty. So you do touch a higher share of that population that is below poverty going to the Decatur alternative. From a community resource standpoint, going towards Avondale, we touch more healthcare facilities and grocery stores. So that is something we do touch going to Avondale. And when we go to Decatur, you can see more educational facilities along that alignment. From a multimodal connection standpoint, there are more existing and planned transit connections. So we do have a lot of planned connections for the Avondale or near the Avondale alternative. And for the Decatur, you're seeing more existing bike facilities. So these are some of the takeaways that we're seeing between the two potential terminus stations. So here's just a few more of the demographics differences between the two terminus stations. So population, equity, and community resources. We kind of talked a little bit about, you already touched many of the medical facilities and pharmacies, nursing homes when you go to the Avondale alternative. You also touched the higher population, anticipated population, as well as employment population going towards Avondale, as well as more grocery stores. We kind of touched upon the Decatur station, where more educational facilities are being touched. And then you're touching the share of the population below poverty, a little higher share. What's approximately equal is the share of minority population, seniors, and zero-car households. So between the two terminus stations, those elements or those demographics are approximately equal. So the next thing I like to talk about from a mode comparison standpoint, it will be the cost and some of these other elements of the differences between the two modes. So if you look at BRT, this is in $2031. We are looking at a $670 million to $860 million project. Now, this does depend on the alignment. So that's why you see that range. For LRT, we're looking at a $2.1 billion to a $3.1 billion project. And I will say with LRT, one thing you have to look at between BRT and LRT is that BRT, we do have maintenance facilities already. And so we just have to retrofit some charging stations into those facilities, whereas LRT, we will have to build a full-on maintenance facility. So that is a higher cost, as well as there are some infrastructure differences between the two. So that's why you get a little bit larger significant or a larger cost when you start talking LRT, especially from infrastructure standpoint. Annual operating costs, you kind of get the same thing. It's lower operating costs right now for BRT from a 4.7 to 9.5 million per year, and where we're talking 14.7 to 28.4 million per year for LRT. Again, you got to think about the different alignments that we're looking at and that range and what we're really considering. Again, operating a mode with more infrastructure does require a lot more operating costs. Travel times are almost even. When you start to look at travel times, you've got 20 to 30 minutes from a full alignment standpoint for BRT, and you got 15 to 26 minutes from LRT. I mean, there's not much difference there when you start talking about travel times. Both are pretty efficient. Implementation time frame. So do you want something built now, or do you want something built later? So that's where we are with this. We're looking at 5 to 7 years for BRT to be built, depending on the alignment again, and some other factors. And then we're looking at 8 to 10 years when we're talking about building out light rail. And so that is a question of, do you want something built now or later? That plays into that. Environmental impacts. We obviously will get lower environmental impacts with BRT because there's less infrastructure. So there's less potential of adverse effects to the environment. Obviously higher potential for LRT because there's more infrastructure, again, that we have to build. And right away, we need to build the LRT system. So those are some of the differences from a mode comparison standpoint. So what are our next steps? I kind of showed you this earlier, our next steps. One thing I do want to do is make sure that I mention that we do need you to go to connectclifton.com to take the survey, because again, your input is very important. It's going to help us make a decision to narrow this down to 3 alternatives or less. And you can do that before August 30th. So you have plenty of time to go do it, but I encourage you to do it as soon as possible while everything's fresh on your mind. Again, the next evaluation stage, when we'll come back to you, the public, to evaluate the few alternatives we have left, will be in the fall 2022. We are, again, looking to have an LPA by the spring of 2023. And as you can see at the bottom here, we are here in June to September 22 at this evaluation standpoint. So those are the next steps. And again, I encourage you to go and take the survey, and encourage your friends as well to take the survey, because we want all the feedback that we can get. So with that, we'll go into the question and answer session. So I'm going to turn it back over to Whitney.
I got it, Brian. Thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you for facilitating all that information. I just want to remind people how to tap in and participate. If you are on YouTube, and we apologize because we know we had a scheduled YouTube and we didn't go live into that scheduled YouTube. But if you are able to find us on YouTube and you have a question and you want to participate live, just be reminded that you have to register and participate in Zoom. If you are already participating in Zoom, please go ahead and type in your questions, type in your comments into the chat box. And I'm looking over to my opposite screen to see my chat box feature. If you would like to, and I'm gonna flip through our participants and see who I can find. If you would like to raise your hand and ask your question aloud, you can certainly do that. And I'm just going over here to see if I can find people who have raised their hands. If you don't know how to use that feature in Zoom, find your buttons on Zoom, look for the reactions button. If you select reactions, you'll see different emojis, but there is a button there to raise your hand. I see that 4 people have their hands raised so far. Give us a few moments and we'll get to your questions. If you are participating on the phone, you dialed in and you are listening to this conversation and you would like to ask your question, you can certainly participate as well. You can do so by selecting *9 on your telephone keypad. The operator will come on and let you know the facilitator has been notified that you wish to speak, and we will acknowledge you as soon as we can. So with that bit of information, I know some people have their hands raised. I also have a few questions that have been queued up about funding that I'll go ahead and ask you, and then we'll tag team in between people that have their hands raised and questions that have been pre-submitted. So we have some questions that were pre-submitted ahead of this meeting, and we want to make sure everyone gets a response. So I'll ask a few of those first about funding, and let me just find my place where that question is. Which option is most likely to get funded? And Brian, I know that you're capable of answering this, but I know some other members of the project team might want to weigh in too. So the floor is open.
Yeah, which option will most likely get funded? Right now for us, all the options that we've put on the table have the same likelihood of getting funded. There's some criteria that the FTA has when it comes to getting into the CIG program, which is the Capital Investment Grant Program, which we will be applying for funding. And right now, all of the options that we've meet a certain criteria. I'll ask Peter to weigh in on that as well.
And sorry, I lost you for just a second there, Brian. What was it that you wanted me to weigh in on?
The FTA criteria essentially being that the question was which option is likely to get funded, and essentially all the options from my perspective that we've chosen have great potential, but there are some criteria that we'll be looking at.
Sure. Well, the Federal Transit Administration, or FTA, has its very specific evaluation criteria. And this is a competitive process. This is not a chunk of change that is just, distributed evenly to every transit authority. MARTA needs to go out there and compete against other projects all around the country for funding. And the evaluation criteria will consider things like, does this look like a cost-effective alternative? And some of the considerations there are, how many riders are anticipated to use this project? Compare that to what is the cost of the project. Well, if we can bring the cost down as much as possible while providing all the transportation benefits that are going to attract riders, that makes the project that much more competitive. So there are lots of considerations like that. And the process to get that funding, after MARTA identifies, this term locally preferred alternative, or LPA, has come up. MARTA can identify that LPA, and then through a federal environmental review process that is required by the Federal Transit Administration for funding, you officially adopt a locally preferred alternative through that process, and then request to go into a further step for competition for federal funding. So that's just touching on it a little bit, Brian.
Thank you, Peter. Okay. We'll turn next.
Thanks, Brian. I'm not equipped to be managing a lot of different buttons at one time, but thank you for allowing me a few moments to manage that. I want to go to a hand raised, and audience participants, forgive me in advance because we're not able to see who raised hands first, but I'm going to go to Darren right now. Yinka, can we unmute Darren? And Darren, as soon as you're unmuted, please ask your question.
Hello, thank you everyone for this session. I think it's incredibly important. Just a thought, and then just a couple quick questions. One, so I saw in some of the promo and social media that there's been talk, specifically of MARTA talking about bus rapid transit and talking about it in the sense of the project that happened in San Francisco with the Van Ness program. So as someone who just moved here from San Francisco and saw that project go over budget, and it was a project that took years and kind of became the laughingstock of the city of just how long it took. My question is, one of the questions is what specifically is Atlanta going to be doing differently to actually keep things to actual budget and time, if that were to be an option? And then I think my other question, and I think some people have been touching on it as well, a little bit, is there was talk in the presentation specifically around environmental impacts, but what if there was to be a BRT option, would it be electric buses? Because I think there's a whole full circle around a carbon footprint. And if it's just going to be a regular gas guzzling bus, then wouldn't that also be an issue? And specifically talking about environmental effects.
Yeah, no, thanks, Darren, for your questions. I'll answer your first question, which centered around the project in San Francisco and the over budget, how it went over budget and so forth, and what Atlanta's going to be doing specifically differently, MARTA in particular. Now, this is our first BRT in the area. One thing we are doing, we're getting a lot of experience because Summer Hill has moved forward. We'll be looking to, we had Industry Day for Summer Hill today. We're looking to move that project into construction soon. So we've learned a lot from that project in general. But we're also using national experts as well. We're not just staying local in the sense of getting an understanding of what we need to do and move this project forward. So we do have national experts. Peter is one, for example, who we brought in from another location from a national expert standpoint. So we're getting some experience now through Summer Hill, but we are also utilizing some of the resources that we have available from a national standpoint to keep costs down and to make sure we continue to move this project forward in a efficient way. Number two, your question around environmental impacts, electric buses. So one thing I know that our interim GM, Kylie Greenwood, has stated that, for our BRT systems, we are using electric buses. We already have electric buses in the system. We're going to be utilizing electric buses on Summer Hill, Campbellton, as well as Clifton. So we are anticipating electric buses for this corridor.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Darren. We're going to go to a question that was submitted in the chat, actually a couple of questions that were submitted in the chat, and then we'll go back over to participants who have your hands raised. Thank you for your patience. Brian, the questions from the chat center around CSX and running in the CSX corridor. So the first question is, will the BRT follow the CSX line? And then I have a second question that asks, is additional right-of-way required beyond the existing CSX right-of-way for BRT? And I know slide 13 has, you're already there, has the alignment for those. So can you talk about BRT following CSX lines?
Yeah. So if you look on the map here, just similar to our LRT, yeah, we will have, it is our desire right now that BRT will follow along CSX as well, just similar to our light rail for majority of the corridor, because it is the most efficient way to operate this BRT in a dedicated right of way. The question around, will we need additional right of way? Right now, we're not anticipating needing any additional right of way outside of CSX, at least in this area. Now, when we get outside of CSX and back into the the public right of way, there are areas where we may need some right of way. There may be areas where, from a roadway perspective, you're talking BRT, we take a lane, or we need right of way to add a lane, or we're operating in some mixed traffic. But the intent is to be all dedicated. But again, in CSX, we are not anticipating within this area to need more right of way.
So the intent is to be in dedicated lanes if we're not in CSX. Thank you for that response. We're going to go to a participant, Cameron. I'm going to unmute you now.
Hi, I'm wondering, I have a few questions. One, which BRT systems and what cities are you looking into the most? Like, I know there's several cities that have BRT, like I know Cleveland, Ohio has it. There's some in Boston, and there's multiple cities in California. Which ones are you planning to, are you looking at in studying the strongest? Like, because all of them I know are different. Some are.
No, Cameron, you're absolutely right. The different areas with regards to where BRT has been implemented and how it looks, we're trying to look at areas that compare to Atlanta. So I'll give you an example. We've also looked at areas with rail corridors. LA has rail corridor that they've implemented a BRT in. Minnesota, Minneapolis, BRT. I also asked Peter and Sanan, what are some of the other cities that we're looking at from a comparison standpoint?
Sure.
Yeah.
Brian, why don't I jump in for a second? This is Peter. And bus rapid transit can be a lot of things. That term is used for something that can be as simple as, what MARTA defines as arterial rapid transit. That's something in shared lanes, with, fewer stops and really nice stations, but not a dedicated lane. That's not what MARTA is referring to when they say bus rapid transit. Brian, would you say it's like MARTA standard is like 70% of the corridor at least has a dedicated transit way? Right. And so that's what we're talking about. In this corridor, we're really saying, hey, 100% of the corridor should have a dedicated travel way. And either that's a transit way that is separate from other city streets, like within the CSX right-of-way, not operating on the tracks, but parallel to the tracks, next to the tracks, separated from the tracks, but still in the property that's owned by the railroad. And then, when you get out of that, having dedicated lanes on a street that are reserved for transit. So other good examples, like Brian brought up the Orange Line in San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. That's an excellent example. There's one in Connecticut that also used a rail right-of-way and reserved the entire rail right-of-way for bus rapid transit. There's a similar project in development down in south of Miami right now. Lots of examples, but and for if we've got street running, you brought up Cleveland, the Health Line in Cleveland. That's a project where the transit has dedicated lanes running in the center of the street, and there are things like doors on both the left side and the right side of the bus rapid transit vehicle, so you can pull up to a station on either side. That may be comparable to what MARTA, one of the alternatives MARTA would be exploring for operating in a street. Lots of good examples out there, but think of the ones that are really designed for very fast, regional connectivity. That's the kind of example we're looking at here.
All right, thank you, Peter.
Hey, it's me again, just fumbling to get my unmute button. Thank you for that. Thank you, Brian. I'll go on to a question about BRT again and how it interacts with traffic in the road, and this was submitted via chat. Will there be a physical barrier considered for BRT? And we've said BRT a number of times just to remind people, bus rapid transit is what BRT stands for. Will there be a physical barrier on the road segments?
Yeah, that's something we've got to continue to evaluate. In some instances, it makes a lot of sense to put a physical barrier, but we also got to think about when it comes to maintenance and things of that nature. If something was to happen to one of the buses, will we be able to get it out of the way from the other buses that are coming? So that's something we'll continue to evaluate. In cases you will have physical barriers and some you won't.
And Brian, someone asked a question to that extent about BRT running in the road or other corridors running in the road. This question asks, will this project run down North Decatur Road?
Yeah, North Decatur Road is an option. As you can see here from the BRT 1 that goes to Avondale, North Decatur Road is an option as to where we would run BRT. So it's one option. Now, how that looks from a dedicated right-of-way perspective, do we take a lane? Do we add a lane? Do we mix traffic? That's still to be determined.
Got it. We're in screen one and we do have further evaluation to do. Brian, I want to go to a participant that has their hand raised. Adam, I'm unmuting you. Will you ask your question? And I will give the preface that I have not before to be considerate of everyone that's on the phone line now. If we can keep our questions to a maximum of one question, if there's a simple follow-up after that, that's considerate. And after that, we would like to move on to other questions.
Sure, thank you, Whitney. I live directly adjacent to the CSX tracks, and it looks like the Emory-Claremont proposed stop would literally be like on the other side of my backyard. And I want to understand exactly, in our neighborhood there, which is called Emory Grove, would we have access to that stop, or would it be only open to like the Emory-Claremont campus?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things we are looking at is potential for access for the neighborhoods to access the station. So that is something when we get into more detailed design, we'll start to look at from a standpoint, is it feasible? Is it safe? How do we do it? So yeah, I think that is an opportunity for us to look at. I can't give you the answer right now that yes, for sure it would, but it is something we are going to evaluate in the later phase here.
Okay, and then just a quick related follow-up is you're negotiating with CSX. I see on this slide we're looking at, this includes possibility of full use and acquisition. Does that mean the CSX trains would no longer use the route, or it's just that MARTA would own it instead of CSX, but CSX would still operate there?
So let me kind of elaborate on the CSX conversation. We would not fully take the entire right of way. CSX would still operate within the right of way. That is what we're looking at right now. So it would be a shared right of way with freight rail, which is barrier separated. So that is what we're looking at right now. Freight trains still would operate in the area.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Brian. Just a reminder, we mentioned it at the top of the meeting. We'll mention again that we won't have time to address all of the questions tonight. We're approaching an hour. It's a good conversation, so I think we have a few minutes to stay over with the team. But in the case that we don't address your question live tonight, please submit it in the Q&A. Please utilize the project website to continue to engage and ask your questions there. We are reviewing and providing written responses to all of the questions asked in the public meeting tonight and all of the meetings that we've had ahead of this one. And we will provide those written responses on our project website. So make sure that you're connected there. We'll go to another participant with your hand raised. I'm looking at, is it Hamed or Hamad? Let me know how to pronounce your name.
It's Hamid.
Hamid. Thank you.
Yes, hi. Thank you for taking my question. I had a question about whether or not ridership projections of LRT versus BRT were considered at all when you did this study, and also the conversion possibility of converting traditional car commuting traffic to LRT versus BRT, and which one would convert more commuters. And lastly, which one, can you comment on the overall capacity of each? Because I know Atlanta's projected to grow by like 3 million in the next 3 decades. So some comment about capacity would also be useful. Thank you.
Yes, I'll comment quickly on the first part with regards to ridership. We're going to be doing ridership analysis in the next phase. We currently have our previous ridership analysis, which for LRT was somewhere around 24,000 riders a day. So we'll see if we're still getting those type of numbers when you talk about LRT and BRT. But we'll have that for the next phase. With regards to the other 2 questions, I'm going to ask the project team if you guys want to weigh in fairly quickly on those.
The capacity issue, and Agnes, feel free to jump in on that one. Both bus rapid transit and light rail transit would be designed to be high capacity services. Now, with light rail transit, you can link multiple rail vehicles together with a single driver, and that's a very high capacity solution, right? Not quite as high capacity as MARTA's existing rail rapid transit services, like the red, gold, and the blue lines in this project area, but it's more capacity than a local bus, right? Well, bus rapid transit is also more capacity than a local bus. It's going to be an articulated vehicle, which means it's a extra long vehicle, and each vehicle would carry over 100 customers as needed. Agnes, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, as what Peter said, that the BRT, the articulated bus, will be able to take more than 100 passengers per car. For the LRT, if we can, usually it's common to operate in single or even though in a double rolling stock arrangement. So the single rolling stock can have a capacity of around 250 passengers. So if we operate in double, that means every single run of LRT will have a 500 passenger capacity.
And one of the ways that you would design BRT to be comparable in capacity is the potential to run with a little more frequency. So people aren't waiting at stops as long, and if one vehicle is filling up, you've got another one coming pretty soon.
And thank you both.
Brian, the next few questions are about design of the corridor. The first question from the chat is, do you have to widen the CSX rail corridor if it were to be used for BRT or LRT?
So no, we don't have to widen the corridor. CSX has a pretty wide corridor in general. We just have to make some adjustment to the tracks of CSX to be able to fit within that corridor. And so we won't need to widen.
And Brian, this participant is concerned about what happens to the yards that back up to the existing rail corridor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for the yards, we don't anticipate right now, at least, having to do anything to the yards. Now, from an aesthetic standpoint, we may look at something like that, what it looks like. But again, we're trying to stay within CSX's corridor. Construction-wise, I'm not able to determine yet if there would be anything impacts from during construction. However, we are looking to stay within the 100-foot right-of-way of CSX.
The 100-foot right-of-way of CSX is the defined corridor right now. Thank you. In regards to a question that was asked earlier in the chat, I think Bill asked the question, if Woodland Hills So it says if they widen Woodland Hills, can it be done on the side away from homes, which is a commercial side instead of a residential side? And I think this points back again to the fact that the CSX rail corridor now interacts with neighborhoods and individuals' homes and backyards. So there's concern again about, can it be done if there is any expansion away from the homes and closer to the commercial? But I think you already suggested that the CSX corridor is 100-foot wide, and as of now, we don't see any need to go outside of that, correct?
Correct. That's what we anticipate now.
Perfect. There's another design question from the chat about the bridge above North Decatur, and this participant asked, would the existing North Decatur bridge over CSX tracks have to be rebuilt for the BRT alternative 3 or 4?
Yeah, that's something we are evaluating. Agnes, if you want to comment on that, but I will say in the detailed design, we'll get more into that later, but I'll let Agnes comment if she wants to.
Yeah, currently right now we are looking at for BRT 3 and BRT 4, the BRT will be over the existing bridge at North Decatur. So it will not need to be rebuilt the existing bridge for now. But
thank you, Agnes. I would like to ask Mark to unmute and ask your question. You have your hand raised?
Yes. Can
Very,
you hear
yes, we can. Please go ahead.
me? I have two questions. So there's a segment that runs between the Emery Grove neighborhood and the Emery Claremont campus. This is sort of related to a question that was already asked, but it's perhaps a touch more specific. And that is, could the right-of-way for whichever option is chosen be put on the Emery campus side of the existing CSX easement? And the second question is, for those of us who access the Emery Claremont campus from the neighborhood, will we be able to cross the route as it's proposed by foot?
The first question, and thank you for your question, Mark. Questions. The first question, Agnes, you want to weigh in on whether, we've considered both sides of the tracks and the difficulty of one side or the other?
We right now will be consider both sides of the track, and we haven't had the final decision in which side, and it will be come to the next phase, and we will look at more detail on which side to put in for now. And for the connections in both sides, that we haven't had a decision right now to the detail yet. Again, in the design development, we can always consider to have a pedestrian bridge to connect to the stations, so that the ridership in either side of the track can be able to access the station without crossing the well. So it will be considered, but we haven't considered in this early stage.
Yeah, because I want to make sure you guys understand these stations that are not terminus stations are intended to be walk-up stations. So just to give you a little context around how the stations are intended to operate.
Thanks, Agnes. Thank you, Brian. We are at 7:30 or 7:31. So we've been together for an hour. I would like to go ahead and allow the participants who have their hands raised to ask their questions, and we'll get a couple of more questions from the chat. And again, we will make sure to respond to all of the questions in writing and post that to our project website. Renee, yes. You're unmuted. And we can hear you. Would you like to ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So one thing I wonder about is the fact that a lot of cars will want to come to this station because it'll access two different directions. If you think about it, you can go into downtown or you can go towards Lindbergh. So what this new station, it seems you need to provide adequate parking. And I think Decatur is so congested and impacted already. I just wonder if it's not better to go out to Avondale where there might be more room. But I'm asking, are you going to build adequate parking so that people that are attracted to this station to get into downtown and get different directions can park? And then the other question is, if you know, on I-85, they built a sound barrier between people's backyards along I-85, just coming out of downtown, just after you leave the downtown connector. Will you consider building in these sound barriers to reduce the sound of all these trains coming through people's backyards?
Thank you for your question, Renee. The first question with regards to, make sure I got that right. Make sure I got that right. Yeah, you might have to ask that one again. I got
parking at stations.
Oh, okay, parking. There we go. Yeah, so with parking, yes, we will provide adequate parking at our terminus station. As you know, Lindbergh already has a lot of parking. We do have parking decks at Lindbergh. Same thing will take place at either the Avondale station, where we are considering the terminus. You're right about Decatur, it is congested. So that is something we're considering. Can we even get enough room for parking? And Avondale will look at a parking deck as well. So yes. Now, for your second part of that question, we, for the most part, let me see here. I just lost my train of thought. Again. Oh, you're on mute.
Is to have similar sound barriers going through people's backyards, because you're going to have, so you take the CSX train, they only come so many times a day, and now you're going to have 10 times as much traffic going through people's backyards now, I think.
Yeah, and so one thing about noise and vibration that we are evaluating, our buses, for one, the electric buses are, you barely know that they're if we're doing BRT. So we wouldn't probably put a noise barrier because the freight rail would still be the loudest thing in the corridor. That's typically the same thing with our LRT, which would be right now, which we're looking at off-wire rail technology. You still wouldn't have as much noise and vibration as you have with the freight rail system. That's something we could consider, but it also becomes a aesthetic issue as well as a issue around actually building that and construction of that in the right of way.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
And Brian, maybe I can just jump in real quick. The environmental review process does consider noise and vibration and sight lines and aesthetics and all those things and potential impacts. And where identified, provides some options to resolve those issues.
Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Brian, I was going to ask, do we have on slide 22 what the next steps are?
Yeah, we can.
That can get us prepped for the fact that we have more analysis, more homework to do. We have to consider and consolidate all of the conversation, comments, and questions and points that you all have brought up here. And not only you all, but all of the participants who have joined us virtually yesterday, in person on Saturday and last Thursday. There was a question in the chat about all of the different stakeholders involved, residents, property owners, business owners that interact with this alignment and how we would be reaching out to them. And to the same point, this is not the only time that we'll be doing engagement. We have a series of pop-up events scheduled over the next month. And as we're doing our homework, we'll actually come out again when we get to the LPA scoping, or not LPA scoping, but when we get to the second screening process. There are three more hands raised. Kyle, I'm unmuting you. Will you ask a question?
Yeah, so I live in Woodland Hills. I just want to thank Brian, Whitney, and the MARTA folks for hosting this session and for staying late. I've used BRT and LRT in other cities, and I just want to voice support for any LRT option. But regardless which route we go, I think it makes sense to leverage the CSX right away as much as possible and go straight to Decatur in order to reduce time and cost. And if BRT is unfortunately the solution, then there really needs to be a physical barrier separating that bus from car traffic, or else that dedicated lane will be absolutely abused by motorists. Thanks again.
Thank you, Kyle, for being succinct and communicating that. We are capturing that here. I'm looking at Daniel, or nope, I did not click on you, Daniel. Let's try that again.
Hello. There were a few questions about the environmental impact review. There was a question from Jacob Sherman: when comparing environmental impacts of BRT versus LRT, does the comparison include operation impact or just the cost for the initial infrastructure? A lot of times when BRT is reviewed, the environmental impact of the tires and the lithium used isn't often taken into consideration, I find. So the permeance that LRT brings really does tend to be kind of favorable in regards to that kind of consideration. Just one further question. Question 4 on the survey doesn't really provide any insight into how the ranking is considered. So is 1 highest or lowest here? And those are my 2 questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. The first question, Peter, you want to weigh in on that, the environmental? I mean, I know we don't necessarily from the environmental impact statement or look at the tires, but that is something to consider. Peter, you have any insight on that?
Sure. And, you know, in the environmental review process, that criteria will be presented to community members for review. There are certain things that need to be evaluated through the federal process, and others that the community may decide to add to the evaluation. And those environmental factors absolutely feed into the final decision about what the transit service will be, what the transit mode will be. As far as the lithium question that came up and batteries, yes, the bus rapid transit vehicles are anticipated to be electrified with batteries, but guess what? The light rail transit vehicles are also anticipated to have batteries on them, so they can have the capability to operate without a wire in some segments, you know, should that be preferred for aesthetics and that sort of thing. So both types of vehicles would be anticipated to have batteries.
Thank you, Peter. As far as the questionnaire, does one of the team members want to answer the intent on question 4?
Sure, I can answer that. This is Sanan with the project team. The order is 1 for question 4. The question is: the characteristics shown in the figure are important in determining the project's competitiveness for federal funding. Please share how important these characteristics are to you. Then there's a list of characteristics. So 1 would be the most important to you, then descending down 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's a good point. Thank you for that. And we will add some clarification to the survey to make sure that that's not a question in the future.
Thank you, Sanan. Looks like we got 2 more hands.
We actually have 1 more hand. Cameron, I know that Brian had his hand up, so I'm going to unmute Brian.
Hi, I stay in the Beltline and Campbellton corridor neighborhood, and I was invited by Marta to attend this session. Thank you for inviting me. So I had 2 quick questions. I know we're on a time limit. So as we see, what is the team doing to get in front of the situation, sort of, of the corridor, such as, you know, listening to the businesses, listening to the people and their feedback, because we don't want to have another scenario like Campbellton Road as to where only 2 modes were offered in the discussions, as to where here is 3 modes that are being talked about amongst the discussions. So how can we ensure that the people and the community are at the forefront of the discussion the entire way? That's the first question. And then number 2, what tools are we using out of the infrastructure law? Because it's promoting innovation. What tools are we using out of the infrastructure law and the program that can help propel this project forward? Because we want the projects to be successful. Thank you.
Sure. And Brian, I can take, it's Brian Beechwood and Brian Hobbs. So I'm speaking to both of you. I can take a stab at the first question, which was about engagement. And I sort of alluded to it before, but we are making sure that the conversation doesn't end here. We continue to have, the survey was mentioned before, we have a public comment period open for at least 45 days where we're actively reaching out to stakeholders across the corridor to get participation. Some of that engagement looks like going out to pop-up events, going out to farmers markets in Decatur, popping up at the MARTA stations in Avondale, Decatur, and Lindbergh, riding some of the buses that depart from those stations into the different neighborhoods and participating with riders at those stations and on buses to solicit their participation and their comment and capturing that in the survey. In addition to that, we've hosted in the spring a series of meetings that were focused on the different areas that interact with the alignment. And the focus was to bring out those large business owners, those small business owners, members of the community, neighborhood leaders, elected officials, to have discussions and to make sure that we really, to your point, Brian, make sure that we get ahead and have the voices of the multitude of neighbors and communities that will be impacted involved in the planning stages. And so it's not perfect. We're continuing to do the work online and offline through some of our pop-up and canvassing work. And the next question was about the innovation policy or law that went into place. And I'm not educated about that particular policy or law, but is there someone on our project team that is and can speak to it?
I could speak to that briefly. For federal investment, yes, you get a higher score if you're showing innovation, for example. What kind of innovation were we talking about? Well, first of all, to create a dedicated transit way for whatever kind of transit we're talking about is innovating in that it's offering new solutions for riders in the corridor and people from all around the region who are trying to get to jobs in this corridor. That in itself is innovation. But cutting edge technology where you are running in a street environment in dedicated lanes, the best, latest technology to give priority at signals for transit to get through, the best technology for getting your ticket and being able to get on and off the bus, the transit vehicle, rail or bus rapid transit. For anybody who's ridden a local bus, you've had the experience of you come to a stop and there's a line of people who want to get on the bus to pay their fare and they're putting cash in the box and you sit and wait. None of that on any of these transit alternatives. All the doors open up. You've paid your fare before you get on, or if there's a vehicle coming and you just need to get on, maybe there's an opportunity to pay your fare once you're on the vehicle, but it's not going to be something that slows down the process at all. Cutting edge technology, all across the board, including electrification.
Thank you, Whitney and Peter.
Absolutely. Brian, do you mind advancing us to the last slide? We are at 7:47, so this is the perfect time to bring our meeting to a close. Not perfect, we're imperfect in that we didn't have enough time to answer all of your questions. Your comments, your feedback is important. The slide that you see ahead of you now speaks to all of the engagement that we've done in this public meeting setting for the last 2 weeks. We've had in-person meetings last week and virtual meetings this week. And all of our virtual meetings have been recorded and are available on MARTA's YouTube page. You can go to YouTube, in the search bar, type in It's MARTA, and their YouTube page will come up there. You can search for this meeting and others, because we know that you all are coming to participate with us from across Atlanta, Decatur, DeKalb, and other places, and you're all stakeholders and interested, and you can find recordings of this meeting and others there. Similarly, you all are well connected in this corridor and across the city, and it really will depend on your participation and your sharing this information with your neighbors, your friends, people that you know couldn't be here. Please share the project website with them, connectclifton.com. That is where they can go to find not only this recording and the written responses to your questions that you've asked. We'll develop an FAQ out of those questions so they can quickly look at it and get the information that they need. Check the chat box to copy down that website, and make sure, again, that you send a quick text or email to someone that you know wanted to be a part of the conversation and you don't see them here today. Finally, you can send us a quick email if you want to dive deeper or get more information about where we'll be popping up, or if you want to get direct information to a neighborhood group that you are a part of. We would love to facilitate that information to you and the community that you're a part of. Just email us at clifton@itsmarta.com. And you can email Brian directly at jhobbs@itsmarta.com. But it's more fun if you email the project team, because we'll all be a part of the conversation. With that, does the project team have anything else to add before we wrap up? Very good. Well, thank you all again for your participation, for your time, for your commitment to the community, your city, and this project. Have a great night.